There's a particular kind of question that should immediately make you suspicious. Not because of the question necessarily being dishonest, but because of the answers you are permitted to give. You are told you can choose freedom or security, tradition or progress, capitalism or socialism, compassion or personal responsibility, faith or reason, the left or the right. 2 doors are placed in front of you, and the consequences of each are explained in excruciating detail. You're warned that refusing to choose one will inevitably deliver you into the other, and then you are told to make your decision. But almost nobody asks who built the room. Almost nobody turns around. Almost nobody checks whether there is a 3rd door behind them. This is the trick of the false dichotomy. It does not need to convince you that one side is completely correct. It only needs to convince you that no other possibilities exist. Once that happens, your thinking has already been contained. You may argue passionately, you may study every detail, you may become an expert in defending your chosen side, but you're still operating within somebody else's frame. And sometimes the most important intellectual decision you can make is not choosing the correct answer. It's rejecting the question itself. Most systems do not maintain control by hiding all information. That would be way too obvious. They maintain control by deciding which disagreements are legitimate to have. You're allowed to debate how high taxes should be, but not always why the systems being taxed have become so expensive in the first place. You're allowed to debate which political party should manage an institution, but not whether that institution should possess so much authority. You're allowed to debate which corporation deserves your money, but not why so many essential parts of life have been turned into recurring payments. The boundaries of acceptable disagreement are often more powerful than censorship. Censorship tells you that you can't speak, but a false dichotomy lets you speak endlessly, provided you never leave the designated arena. It gives you the experience of rebellion without the danger of independent thought. You can yell at the other team, you can mock their contradictions, you can watch hours of commentary explaining why they are stupid, evil, brainwashed, or all 3. But as long as both teams continue accepting the same underlying premise, the structure survives untouched. This is one reason modern political arguments feel so exhausting. We're fighting constantly, yet almost nothing fundamental seems to change. Every election is described as the most important election of our lives. Every controversy is treated as a final battle between civilization and barbarism, and every concession is portrayed as surrender. Then the election ends, the outrage shifts, but the fundraising emails continue, and the cost of living keeps rising. The institutions remain, and the public becomes more hostile towards itself, and the people with the most power become increasingly insulated from the consequences. The conflict is real, the disagreements are real, the suffering is certainly real, but the frame through which we interpret it may be incomplete. I understand this because for a long time I saw politics through a very specific lens. I was a very big Trump supporter. It was not merely that I preferred one candidate over another. I saw Trump as a response to a system that had become dishonest, bloated, condescending, and disconnected from ordinary people. He was willing to say the things that respectable institutions would not say. He attacked the people who seemed to be untouchable. He exposed the fact that much of what presents itself as neutral expertise is still influenced by status, money, ideology, and self-preservation. To me, the political left just simply did not offer different solutions. It appeared to be wrong at the very foundation. When people on the left described inequality, discrimination, corporate power, economic insecurity, or institutional failure, my instinct was often to just reject the entire argument. I had seen where their proposed solutions could lead. More bureaucracy, more centralized control, more dependency, more power placed in institutions that had already proven themselves unworthy of trust. So when the left identified a problem, I often assumed that the problem itself had been exaggerated, distorted, or invented to justify the solution. That's an easy pattern to fall into. Once you recognize that someone's prescription is flawed, you just begin assuming that their diagnosis must also be false. But those are 2 entirely different questions. A person can correctly identify a wound and still recommend the wrong treatment. They can misunderstand the cause while accurately describing the pain. They can even weaponize a genuine problem for political purposes without making the problem imaginary. Over time, particularly through genuine conversation with people outside my political world, I began noticing something uncomfortable. Many of the people I had dismissed were responding to the same conditions I was. They also believed that powerful institutions had become detached from ordinary people. They also believed the economy was being manipulated for the benefit of a protected class. They also believed that corporations had too much influence. They also believed that people were working harder while receiving less security, less community, and less control over their lives. They also sensed that something fundamental had been lost. We disagreed about who was responsible. We disagreed about the language used to describe it. We disagreed intensely about what should replace the current system. But beneath those disagreements was often a shared observation that the system was not working for most people. That realization didn't require me to abandon every conservative belief I held. It required me to separate my beliefs from my reflexes. It required me to listen for the truth hidden inside language I disliked. It required me to stop asking, "Is this person on my side?" and start asking, "What are they seeing that I might not be seeing?" That's a much more dangerous question for the system, because once you begin asking it honestly, no political tribe can completely own you. Consider how the right and left often talk about economic dependence. The right sees a population becoming increasingly dependent on the government. The left sees a population becoming increasingly dependent on employers and corporations. The right worries that welfare systems can trap people in permanent dependency. The left worries that losing a job can mean losing healthcare, housing, stability, and the ability to survive. One side says people need greater personal responsibility. The other says people need greater economic security. These are presented as opposing moral visions. But are they necessarily opposites? What if genuine independence requires both responsibility and security? A person who cannot survive without government assistance is not fully free, and a person who cannot leave an abusive employer without losing everything is not fully free either. One form of dependence is public, the other is private. But dependence does not become freedom simply because the institution controlling your life has shareholders instead of voters. The third path is not splitting the difference by making people moderately dependent on both. It's asking what conditions would allow people to become less dependent on either. What would help ordinary people own more? What would make it easier to start small businesses? What would allow families to survive on fewer working hours? What would rebuild local institutions capable of solving problems without waiting for permission from a distant government or a multinational corporation? What would give workers enough bargaining power to say no? What would give communities enough strength to care for their own? Those questions don't fit neatly within the approved categories. They combine concerns associated with both sides while refusing the assumptions of either. The same pattern appears in the debate between tradition and progress. One side recognizes that institutions like family, religion, neighborhood, and inherited culture provide stability, meaning, and identity. The other recognizes that traditions can become mechanisms through which injustice and domination are preserved. Both observations can be true. A society that destroys every tradition will eventually produce people with no identity beyond consumption, employment, and political affiliation. A society that treats every tradition as sacred will preserve cruelty merely because it is old. The choice is not between worshipping the past and erasing it. The better path is learning to inherit critically. Preserve what makes human life meaningful, but reform what makes human beings small and invalid. Tradition should be a conversation with the dead, not a dictatorship imposed by them. Progress should be movement towards something better, not movement for its own sake. But our political categories rarely allow that distinction. You must either defend the institution in its present form or participate in its destruction. You must call everything oppressive or call nothing oppressive. You have to choose a uniform, and once you put it on, your opinions become increasingly predictable. The deepest problem is not that we are incapable of complexity. It is that complexity is socially expensive. Beliefs are rarely just beliefs, they become signals of loyalty. They tell each other and other people where we belong, who we trust, what kind of person we are, and which enemies we share. Once an opinion becomes part of your identity, changing your mind no longer feels like correcting an error. It feels like betraying your people. This is why political conversations so often fail. The participants are not merely exchanging information, they are defending membership. A conservative may privately recognize that a left-wing criticism contains some truth, but fear that acknowledging it will be interpreted as surrender. A A progressive may recognize the destructive consequences of a proposed policy, but fear that criticizing it will provide ammunition to the wrong party. So both remain silent about what they can see. Each side becomes aware of the other side's hypocrisy while becoming dependent on its own. You learn which facts can be mentioned, you learn which examples must be ignored, you learn which victims matter and which complicate the narrative. You learn when nuance is considered wisdom and when nuance is considered cowardice. Eventually, you don't even need to be censored. Your desire to remain accepted just does the work automatically. This is one of the reasons genuine conversation is so powerful. And I don't mean debate, I don't mean performance. I mean not waiting for somebody to finish speaking so you can deploy the response you mentioned earlier. Actual conversation. Because a real conversation allows two people to lower their weapons without pretending their differences don't exist. It makes room for someone to say, I still disagree with your solution, but I understand why the problem looks that way from where you're standing. That sentence may sound weak in an environment built around victory. In reality, it's the beginning of independent thought. You cannot find the third path while remaining terrified of understanding the first two. Understanding is not agreement. Empathy is not submission. Recognizing that your opponent has correctly perceived something does not require accepting everything they believe. It simply means truth matters more to you than the consistency of your own political party. This is where an important distinction has to be made. The third path is not always centrism. It is not automatically the midpoint between two existing positions. If one person says 2 + 2 = 4, and another says 2 + 2 = 6, the courageous third path is not declaring that it equals 5. Compromise can be useful when dividing resources or negotiating interests, but it cannot determine truth. The third path does not ask, how can we combine half of each answer? It asks, what premises are both answers accepting? Imagine two prisoners arguing over which wall of the cell should be painted. One wants blue, the other wants red. They'll spend hours debating the psychology of color. They'll form factions. They'll accuse each other of wanting to destroy the person's character. Then you get a third prisoner who asks whether the door is locked. He's not moderate. He's operating at a completely different level. That's what outside-of-the-box thinking actually means. It's not being quirky. It's not automatically rejecting popular ideas. It's not believing every conspiracy theory simply because respectable people dismiss it. Reflexive contrarianism is still a form of dependence. You remain controlled by the mainstream because your position is determined by opposing whatever it says. Real independence means being willing to agree with anyone when they are right, and disagree with anyone when they are wrong. It means refusing to outsource your beliefs to either authority or rebellion. Sometimes society is correct. Sometimes the taboo idea is taboo because it's destructive. Sometimes the experts genuinely understand the subject better than you do. But sometimes a forbidden question threatens an arrangement that benefits from remaining unquestioned. You have to examine the idea itself. Not merely the status of the person saying it, not whether it sounds respectable, not whether it will make your friends uncomfortable, not whether the algorithm will reward it. Is it true? What assumptions does it depend on? What evidence would disprove it? Who benefits if you believe it? Who benefits if you never consider it? Those questions cannot guarantee that you will reach the truth, but refusing to ask them nearly guarantees that someone else will determine your reality for you. And this pattern is not merely political, it appears in theology as well. Religious arguments are frequently presented as a choice between rigid dogmatism and complete disbelief. Either accept every inherited interpretation without question, or abandon faith entirely. Either God is an authoritarian ruler waiting to punish disobedience, or God is a comforting metaphor with no claim on how we live. Either Scripture must function like a modern scientific textbook, or it has nothing meaningful to reveal. But these categories are often much newer and narrower than the faith itself. Theology becomes alive when we stop treating inherited questions as though they exhaust the possibilities of God. Jesus repeatedly refused the categories offered to him. When religious authorities tried to force him into a dispute, he often exposed the assumption beneath it. Who is my neighbor? Who has the authority to forgive? Is healing permitted on the Sabbath? Should this person be condemned? Who deserves honor? Who belongs inside the kingdom? Again and again, the answer did not fit the permitted structure. The supposedly righteous weren't always the righteous ones. The supposedly unclean weren't always beyond redemption. Power didn't prove divine favor, and suffering didn't prove divine rejection. The kingdom of God didn't map cleanly onto the political or religious tribes competing for control. The truth came from outside the frame. That may be one of the most uncomfortable aspects of genuine faith. God is not required to respect our factions. We want divine confirmation that our enemies are entirely wrong and our side is uniquely righteous. But truth rarely grants us that satisfaction. It exposes the cruelty hidden inside our virtues, exposes the fear hidden inside our certainty, and exposes the ways we use correct beliefs to avoid becoming better people. The third path is not theological vagueness. It's the recognition that reality is larger than the arguments we've inherited. Political division is often discussed as though Americans disagree because we've become too different. I increasingly suspect the opposite is sometimes true. We're divided because we're similar enough to threaten the same systems. People on both sides feel that they've lost control over their lives. Both are suspicious of distant elites. Both believe institutions manipulate language to conceal self-interest. Both see families struggling. Both sense that communities have weakened, and both believe the other side is being used by powerful forces. Really, both are partially correct. The easiest way to prevent people with shared problems from cooperating is to convince each group that the other group is the problem. Tell struggling workers on the right that struggling workers on the left want to destroy everything they value. Tell struggling workers on the left that struggling workers on the right are uniquely responsible for maintaining the system hurting them both. Make every issue symbolic and make every disagreement personal. Transform policy into identity. Then watch people who own very little defend competing factions of people who own almost everything. This doesn't mean the left and right are secretly identical either. They're not. There are genuine moral disagreements that cannot be erased with better communication. There are ideas that should be rejected. There are policies with real consequences. Unity does not require pretending that every belief is equally wise. But unity does not require identifying where conflict is being manufactured, exaggerated, or redirected. It requires noticing when two groups are proposing different solutions to the same wound. It requires asking whether a new solution might address what both sides correctly perceive. The goal should not be to eliminate disagreement. A society without disagreement is either dead or terrified. The goal is to disagree without becoming incapable of seeing and loving one another. Because once you can no longer recognize any truth in your opponent, you're no longer evaluating ideas. You're protecting a myth. So what do we actually do? The first step is to identify the hidden premise. Whenever you're presented with two choices, write down what both choices assume. If the argument is government controls versus corporate controls, both options may assume that some distant institution must control a resource. If the argument is career success versus financial failure, both may assume that your worth depends on participation in the conventional career structure. If the argument is endless economic growth versus economic collapse, both may assume that society cannot function unless consumption continually expands. The premise is often where the real argument should begin. The second step is to separate the problem from the proposed solution. Listen closely enough to understand what pain the other person is describing. Don't immediately debate their explanation. Ask what they have experienced. Ask what they are afraid of losing. Ask what value they are attempting to protect. Then evaluate the solution independently. You may discover that you share the concern while rejecting the method. The third step is to ask what each side sees clearly. Not what each side claims to see. What do their strongest arguments reveal about them? The left may see forms of power the right overlooks, and the right may see forms of dependency the left overlooks. One may understand how markets concentrate control, the other may understand how governments concentrate control. Perhaps freedom requires resisting both. The fourth step is to become willing to disappoint your tribe. This may be the hardest part of all. Independent thought has a legitimate social cost. People who once praised your intelligence may suddenly question your character. We see this with Trump going after Tucker Carlson just because he disagreed, even though at one time he was his biggest supporter. Your refusal to repeat the approved position will be interpreted as support for the enemy. You may lose the comfort of knowing exactly who is supposed to applaud. But there is no meaningful freedom without the ability to endure disapproval. A person whose beliefs are determined by applause is not free. He's performing. Finally, remember that you do not need a complete alternative before questioning a false choice. That's another trap in and of itself. People will demand that you present a perfect replacement before they allow you to criticize the existing structure. But recognizing that a building on fire does not require you to possess blueprints for the new one. You can reject a false premise before knowing the full truth. Sometimes intellectual honesty begins with the 3 words, "I don't know." Not knowing is not failure. Pretending that the available options contain the entire truth is failure. For years, I thought intellectual strength meant being able to defend my side against the other. Now I think it means something more difficult. It means being able to hear an argument that threatens your identity without immediately trying to destroy it. It means recognizing truth spoken by people you don't trust. It means admitting when your opponents have identified something your allies would prefer to ignore. It means retaining your convictions without allowing them to become walls around your perception. I still have political beliefs. I still think some ideas are better than others. I still believe certain solutions would create more dependence, more bureaucracy, and less freedom. Seeing common ground doesn't require becoming neutral about everything. It requires becoming more loyal to truth than to the emotional security of being unquestionably on the correct team. Our society does not merely suffer from bad answers. It suffers from questions designed to prevent better answers from emerging. We are offered 2 forms of dependence and told to call one freedom, 2 forms of control and told to call one justice, 2 incomplete stories and told that accepting either requires hating everyone who accepts the other. But you're not obligated to choose between 2 cages. You're not obligated to inherit every enemy your tribe gives you. You are not obligated to view another person's insight as dangerous simply because their politics are different from yours. The person across from you may not be seeing an entirely different world than you. They may be seeing a different part of the same machine. In the moment both of you become willing to compare what you see, the machine loses one of its greatest protections, your hostility. So when the world places 2 doors in front of you and demands that you choose immediately, pause. Examine the hinges. Study the walls. Question the person who designed the room. Then turn around. The 3rd door was never hidden. You were simply trained not to look for it. That's it for this one. I'll see you in the next video.